For more than 200 years, a group of people living deep in the Appalachian Mountains had no real answer for what they were. Dark skin, high cheekbones, light-colored eyes, a Scots-Irish accent, Baptist church every Sunday. They didn't fit into any box America had built, so America decided to make them a problem. Census workers left them off the records. Courts stripped away their legal rights. Neighbors gave them a name that started life as an insult. And when people pushed them for an explanation, the families gave the one answer that kept them safe. We're Portuguese. We're Turkish. Our people were sailors, shipwrecked somewhere in the Mediterranean, and they wandered into these mountains generations ago. That story got repeated for so long, in so many households, that it hardened into something close to gospel. And then DNA testing arrived, and it took that story apart, piece by piece. The real answer wasn't Mediterranean. It wasn't even Old World at all. It was American, buried inside 4 centuries of this country's history, hidden so carefully and for so long that uncovering it tells you almost everything about how race actually functioned here, and how far people were willing to go just to stay alive. This is the story of the Melungeons, and it turns out to be far stranger, far darker, and far more human than any tale about lost Mediterranean sailors. But to understand who these people really were, you have to start with the land itself, because in this story, the land isn't just scenery, it's part of the explanation. Quick question before we get into it. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Picture the southern end of the Appalachian Range, not as one mountain, but as a whole tangled system of parallel ridges and narrow valleys, running from the northeast down to the southwest. In Hancock and Hawkins counties in northeastern Tennessee, spilling over into Lee County in southwestern Virginia and touching the eastern edge of Kentucky, you find one of the most isolated stretches of land in the entire eastern United States. Places like Newman's Ridge and Vardee Valley, where the mountains themselves made travel brutal and kept outsiders away, where a community could sit in what amounted to a geographic pocket for generation after generation, cut off from the plantation lowlands, cut off from major roads, tucked into the folds of the terrain. And that isolation wasn't random. For the families who would eventually be labeled Melungeon, these mountains weren't the home they grew up knowing. They were a destination, a place to escape to. They ended up there because further east, life had become impossible to sustain. Even the word Melungeon is still up for debate. Nobody has fully nailed down where it came from. Some researchers point to a French word meaning mixture. Others suggest an Afro-Portuguese term that translates loosely to shipmate or companion. Still others propose entirely different roots. The uncertainty around the name mirrors the uncertainty around the people themselves, both carrying mystery at their center. What historians do know for sure is that the term was used from the outside, thrown at these families as an insult by white neighbors in the early 1800s, and it got attached to somewhere around 40 core family lines clustered in those Tennessee and Virginia mountain counties. Certain surnames show up over and over in old records: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, Mullins, and others. Today, the number of people who trace some ancestry back to these families likely runs into the hundreds of thousands, spread out across the American South and well beyond it. But strip away the folklore, and what does this label actually mean once you look at the genetics and the paper trail behind it? This is where the story starts getting complicated. Melungeon was never a tribe. It was never a nation. It was never a clean, tidy biological category. It was a social label, applied unevenly, argued over constantly, and eventually taken back by the descendants themselves, who found a kind of strength in claiming it on their own terms. And the ancestry running through those 40-odd families isn't identical from one line to the next. Different branches carry different mixes of ancestry, and the mountains themselves are part of the reason why. Hundreds of separate isolated hollows meant that individual pockets of families developed along their own paths. So when people ask who the Melungeons really were, they're actually asking about the specific conditions that produced these families in the first place. And to understand those conditions, you have to leave Appalachia behind entirely and go back to colonial Virginia, to a narrow window of time that most standard American history lessons skip right over. The families that would eventually carry the Melungeon label first show up in Virginia's colonial records in the late 1600s and early 1700s, not listed as enslaved people, but as free people of color, or free mulatto, to use the language of that period. They owned land, they paid taxes. For a stretch of time, some of them could even vote. They lived on the edges of colonial society, but they were not in bondage, and that single fact would end up shaping everything that came afterward. So where did they come from? Before that moment in the record, this is exactly where DNA evidence speaks the loudest. Geneticists use several different tools to trace different lines of family history. The Y chromosome passes down from father to son, generation after generation, without mixing in anything from the mother's side. It carries specific genetic markers, called haplogroups, that let researchers trace one paternal line far back through time. Mitochondrial DNA works the opposite way, passed down only through mothers, tracing a single direct maternal line. Then there's autosomal DNA, the broader blend inherited from every ancestral line at once. It captures a wider picture but gets diluted with each generation, which makes it a less precise tool for tracing ancestry that's very far back in time. When researchers studied the core Melungeon families using Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, publishing their results in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy in 2012, authored by Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Crane, the findings caught a lot of people off guard, especially those who had spent years invested in a very different origin story. The maternal lines, traced through mitochondrial DNA, turned out to be mostly European, largely Northern and Central European in origin. The paternal lines, traced through the Y chromosome, turned out to be mostly sub-Saharan African. In plain terms, the genetic evidence points to a founding generation made up of African men and European women coming together somewhere in the colonial Chesapeake region in a period before the full legal machinery of racial slavery had locked completely into place. This is exactly where a basic understanding of colonial American history becomes essential to the whole story. Before roughly the 1660s and 1670s, the legal and social boundaries separating African and European identity in Virginia hadn't fully solidified yet. The plantation economy was still taking shape. Some Africans living in early Virginia were held as indentured servants rather than permanent slaves, meaning they served out a fixed term, then gained their freedom, and from there could own land and even hire their own workers. The rigid line that would eventually define American slavery hadn't been drawn yet, not completely. And in that specific window, out on the frontier settlements and tobacco farms of early Virginia, African men and European women built families together. Their children were born free, because under the colonial law of the time, a child's legal status followed the mother's status, and these mothers were free women. The evidence suggests it was exactly this founding generation, African fathers, European mothers, and their freeborn children, that became the ancestors of the families later branded as Melungeon. But then the laws shifted. Virginia and the surrounding colonies began tightening their racial codes. Rights that free people of color had once held started disappearing. By the early 1700s, free black and mixed-race families were facing new restrictions on voting, on owning weapons, on giving testimony in court, on marrying across racial lines. The world these families had been born into was being rebuilt around them in real time, and simply being classified as a free person of color was turning into a genuinely dangerous position to hold. So they moved. This is the migration that ultimately shaped the Melungeons, and it didn't start in Portugal or Turkey. It started in Virginia. These families pushed steadily southwest along the Appalachian corridor, moving through North Carolina, where old tax records list them as free mulatto in Orange County by the mid-1700s, continuing on into the Yadkin Valley, then into the New River region, and further still into the Tennessee frontier, eventually reaching Newman's Ridge and Vardy Valley by the early 1800s. With every move, these families intermarried with white settlers. They took on English and Scots-Irish surnames. Their physical appearance lightened with each passing generation. On the 1790 census, some of the very same families listed as mulatto only decades before were now recorded as white. That shift in classification wasn't purely about the law changing underneath them. It was also about how these families actively worked the system, through relocation, through intermarriage, through carefully managing how they presented themselves to the outside world. The mountains offered something the Virginia lowlands no longer could: distance from the plantation economy, frontier conditions loose enough to leave room for ambiguity, and neighbors who hadn't been watching closely enough to piece together the full history. That ambiguity wasn't an accident. It was a survival strategy. There's also the matter of Native American ancestry running through this story. The folklore around the Melungeons leaned heavily on the idea of Indian blood, partly because claiming Native heritage carried far less legal danger than claiming African heritage, and partly because the physical appearance of many Melungeon families struck outsiders as having something indigenous mixed in. DNA testing has, in fact, turned up real Native American ancestry in some lines connected to certain Melungeon families, including the Sizemore line. But when researchers tested the direct paternal and maternal lines of the core families, Native ancestry didn't come through as the dominant or consistent thread. It was genuinely present in some places. It just wasn't the foundation the whole community was built on. The Native identity woven into the Melungeon story was, in different lines, partly real, partly a protective cover, and across the board, blown up far beyond what the genetic record actually supports, thanks to generations of storytelling layered on top of it. Which brings us to the myths themselves, because those myths were never separate from the DNA story. They're part of the same story: the Portuguese theory, the Turkish settlers theory, the Phoenician sailors theory, the claim of descent from the lost Roanoke colony. None of these were genuine memories passed down from actual ancestors who sailed in from the Mediterranean. They were strategies, carefully maintained across generations and collectively reinforced because they were legally useful. In a country where being identified as black meant losing everything under the racial codes of the antebellum South, and later, under Jim Crow, claiming African ancestry meant exclusion from white schools, from voting booths, from property rights, from the legal right to marry across the color line. These laws weren't vague or symbolic. They were explicit and enforced with real force. Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act, nearly 2 centuries after these families first started their migration through the mountains, was still actively targeting mixed heritage families, invalidating marriages and digging through family histories, looking for any trace of non-white ancestry. The Mediterranean origin myth wasn't some romantic flourish. It functioned as legal armor. A Tennessee journalist named Will Allen Dromgoole wrote a series of pieces in 1891 that sensationalized the Melungeons and helped cement the exotic origins mythology into the wider public imagination, describing them in condescending terms as mysterious half-breeds with strange features and stranger customs. The framing itself was demeaning, but it also fed into a narrative that Melungeon families had already been circulating themselves, for entirely different and far more practical reasons. Then, in the 1990s, a writer named Brent Kennedy published a widely read book arguing for Turkish and Portuguese ancestry among the Melungeons, and a large number of descendants embraced the idea with real enthusiasm. It offered an identity that felt colorful and ancient, free of the stigma American racial history had permanently attached to African ancestry. The book made national headlines. Communities organized themselves around the Turkish and Mediterranean theory. Then the DNA results landed in 2012, and the reaction was intense. Lead researcher Roberta Estes later described how upset many people were by what the testing revealed. And that reaction genuinely deserves some honest consideration. When a community has spent generations constructing a protective story, and that story was never just vanity but an actual shield against violence, land loss, and legal persecution, having it taken apart by a lab result isn't some small neutral moment. It carries the full weight of everything American racial history did to these families across 400 years. But the researchers made a point that's worth sitting with. The real story isn't something to be ashamed of. It isn't a lesser story. It's the story of people who navigated one of the most brutal racial systems in American history and came out the other side still standing. African men and European women in early colonial Virginia built families together during a brief window when that was still possible. When the law slammed that window shut, their children moved. When the next place turned hostile too, they moved again. They gave themselves new names, intermarried with purpose and strategy, carried English surnames deep into mountain hollows where nobody would think to ask too many questions, and repeated the Portuguese story so consistently for so many generations that eventually even their own descendants believed it completely. That isn't weakness. That's the full force of human resilience, pushed up against a system that was never designed to let them survive at all. Across the wider Appalachian region, the Melungeons weren't some isolated, one-of-a-kind case. Historians have documented several similar communities scattered throughout the American South, groups sometimes referred to as tri-racial isolates, communities that formed where European, African, and indigenous populations came together, almost always in frontier areas where racial enforcement was loose enough to allow it to happen. The Lumbee people of North Carolina, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina, the Red Bones found in parts of Louisiana and Texas. Each of these groups came together under conditions similar to what shaped the Melungeons, and each one developed its own set of identity strategies for surviving inside America's rigid racial classification system. The Melungeons were one chapter within a much larger American pattern, not an exception to it. And even inside the Melungeon community itself, the genetic picture isn't uniform from family to family. The same mountains that sheltered these families also kept them apart from one another. Families around Newman's Ridge carried different histories than families in Vardee Valley. Some lines lean more heavily European. Others carry more African ancestry. Some side branches show genuine Native American mixing through women who married into these families along the way. The broader autosomal DNA picture, the blend pulled from every ancestral line combined, is still being actively researched. Scientists studying this have pointed out that the full picture isn't entirely settled yet, and that some newer results hint at layers of ancestral diversity that direct line testing alone can't fully capture. The science here is real, and it's also still evolving. Had both the means and the determination to keep moving, refusing to stop until they reached mountains high enough to disappear into. The word Melungeon began its life as an insult. The DNA sitting behind it is a record of 4 centuries of survival. And the communities carrying that identity today, whatever specific blend of ancestry any individual person holds, are the living descendants of people who refused, through relocation, through myth-making, through careful intermarriage, and through sheer determination to be erased by a system that was built specifically to erase them. DNA doesn't hand you a simpler version of this story, it hands you a truer one. And that truth once you take it in fully, isn't made smaller by the absence of Portuguese sailors on some shipwrecked voyage. If anything, it becomes larger. Once you understand what actually happened in those mountain hollows of Appalachia, in the fog settling over Newman's Ridge, in the names on faded old census pages, shifting from mulatto to free to white across the decades. Follow that thread far enough, and you can trace the whole arc of what these people chose to do in the face of a system designed to destroy them. They chose to survive, and they did exactly that. It's worth stepping back for a second and thinking about what this really means beyond one region or one set of family names. The Melungeon story is, in a lot of ways, a window into something much bigger about how identity gets built, protected, and passed down under pressure. Most of us think of family history as something fixed, something you simply inherit and pass along unchanged. But what these families actually did was build identity as a tool, shaping it, adjusting it, and defending it across 200 years, because getting it wrong could cost them everything they had. That's not a footnote to American history. That's a core part of how millions of families, not just in Appalachia, but across the entire country, actually navigated a system built on rigid categories that never had room for the reality of how people actually lived, loved, and formed families. The DNA results didn't erase the Melungeon story. They finished it, connecting a folk memory that had survived for centuries to the real historical events that had shaped it all along. And in doing that, they gave these families something the myths never could. A story that's entirely their own, built on what genuinely happened, rather than on what once felt safer to say out loud. There's another layer to this that's worth slowing down on. The sheer mechanics of how a family could flip from one racial category to another on paper, sometimes within a single generation. Census takers in the 1700s and 1800s weren't running any kind of scientific process. They were making snap judgments, walking door to door, looking at a person's skin, their hair, their manner of speech, and writing down whatever category seemed to fit at that moment. There was no consistency required from one county to the next, or even from one census taker to the next inside the same county. A family could be recorded as mulatto in one decade and white the next. Not because anything about their ancestry had changed, but because the person holding the pen made a different snap judgment, or because that family had, by then, moved further from anyone who remembered their history, or intermarried enough times that the visual markers outsiders relied on had faded. This is part of why the paper trail on Melungeon families is so inconsistent and, frankly, so maddening for historians to follow. The categories themselves were never stable. They were subjective judgments dressed up as official record-keeping, and families who understood that instability learned to work it to their advantage wherever they could. Who they let their children marry, and which version of their history got repeated at the dinner table. A grandmother telling her grandchildren about Portuguese sailors wasn't necessarily lying to them out of shame. In many cases, she may have genuinely believed it herself because that story had been repeated so consistently for so many generations, precisely because believing it and repeating it kept the family safe. That's part of what makes the DNA results land so hard for some descendants today. It's not just discovering a different ancestry, it's realizing that an entire family's protective strategy worked so well it eventually convinced its own inheritors. The broader pattern of tri-racial isolate communities across the American South deserves a bit more attention too, because it shows the Melungeons weren't some strange, isolated anomaly, but one visible example of something that happened again and again wherever frontier conditions gave mixed-race families room to settle before rigid racial law caught up with them. The Lumbee of North Carolina built an identity and a recognized community structure that persists strongly today, with their own long and complicated relationship to state and federal recognition. The Brass Ankles of South Carolina, the Red Bones of the Louisiana and Texas borderlands, the Jackson Whites of New York and New Jersey, and several smaller groups scattered through the Virginia and Carolina backcountry, all followed roughly similar paths. Free families of mixed African, European, and sometimes Native ancestry formed in the early colonial period before slavery's legal architecture fully hardened, who then found themselves pushed toward the edges of settled society as that architecture closed in around them. Each of these communities developed its own name, its own local mythology, and its own strategies for surviving inside a system that had no real category for what they actually were. Understanding the Melungeons properly means understanding that they were part of a much larger, largely undertaught chapter of American history, one where the country's rigid racial binary simply didn't match the messy reality of who was actually living, working, and building families on its frontiers. Modern DNA testing has only added more texture to this picture rather than closing the book on it entirely. Direct-to-consumer testing services, the kind anyone can now order online, have let thousands of descendants check their own ancestry against what the historical record and earlier academic studies suggested. For many families, the results have lined up closely with the 2012 findings, confirming a mix of European and African ancestry with occasional Native American threads in specific lines. For others, the picture has come back more complicated. A reminder that 40-some founding families, spread across 3 centuries and thousands of marriages, were never going to produce one single uniform genetic signature. Researchers in this field continue to stress that genetic ancestry testing has real limits, particularly the further back in time you try to trace a line, and that the most reliable conclusions come from combining DNA evidence with the documentary record, wills, tax rolls, church registers, court cases, rather than treating a single test result as the final word. That combination of hard genetic data and painstaking archival research is what turned the Melungeon story from a stubborn regional legend into one of the best documented case studies of racial reclassification in early American history. Let me know in the comments which community or region you'd want covered next, and if you found this one worth your time, go ahead and like the video and share it with someone who'd find it just as interesting.